So in Matthew 5:32, we read, "But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of unchastity causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." So what can we conclude from Matthew's exception here? Well, first of all, divorce is adulterous. It's like all the other sins a man commits in this context. To divorce his wife is just as sinful as lusting, or murder, that whole list of what a man can do. But even worse, not only is it sinful for the man, the husband is causing his wife to commit adultery. And that's because in this patriarchal world, most divorced women would need to marry again to survive. I mean, a few could return to their father's house, assuming the father's still alive and that the father could afford it. But most of the time, that wasn't possible any longer. And marriage to someone else was the only option.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is A. Andrew Doss, and we'll be discussing his book, Remarriage in Early Christianity. I'm not going to spend a lot of time setting this up because the conversation it's pretty long. It covers a lot of things, so long intro will not be productive. Just keep in mind, if you have guest suggestions or feedback for me, you could reach me at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. I'd also like to hear back on, do you want episodes to be the entire episode all dropped in one? Or if they reach a certain length, do you want me to split them up? All that kind of thing you can pass along to me at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. So without further ado, here's my conversation with A. Andrew Doss. A. Andrew Doss, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thanks for having me again. I'm serve as the Niebuhr Distinguished Chair and Professor of Religious Studies here at Elmhurst University in Chicagoland, not far from O'Hare Airport. I'm the author, editor of over 10 books in biblical studies, but especially in the Apostle Paul, including an 800-page commentary on Paul's letter to the Galatians from Concordia, but especially this most recent book that we have, Remarriage in Early Christianity.
Yeah, so Remarriage in Early Christianity is what we're here to talk about. So I sent you some questions. I always send some questions in advance, and the first one, it's kind of a big question, so it's probably going to be a bit of a long story, but I want to frame why I thought this was so important. So this book takes ancient Greco-Roman society, it takes Judaism in antiquity, it takes historical Jesus, it takes Gospels, it takes Paul, and it takes early Christianity. And it's got all of those things. That's a lot. So my first question is, were you researching something else and you were motivated to do this? Or how did you stumble on I'm going to condense all of these things into talking about remarriage in early Christianity?
Sure. Well, this story began in the late 1980s. I was serving as the editor for my seminary student theology journal, and a student had just finished his master's thesis and sent a paper to the journal based on it. And it turns out that a new book had come out a few years earlier, back in 1984, titled Jesus and Divorce by William Heth and Gordon Wenham. They were Protestant evangelicals, and they were taking this unusual position that Jesus had strictly forbidden remarriage after divorce. And I had never heard that view before. I mean, my church tradition, I'm Lutheran, has always held that remarriage is permitted for the innocent party of a divorce. But what struck me is that the author of this essay was struggling with why the original biblical text of Matthew 19:9 really does have an exception clause in it for divorce and remarriage. It turns out that the earliest and the best Greek manuscripts will disagree on this. And so I agreed with him that a strong case can be made that the exception clause is there and that it is modifying divorce or marriage. But I was troubled in his paper how he had listed several of the earliest Christian authors prior to the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, and every one of them had denied that remarriage after divorce is possible. So it seemed that our modern marriages of innocent parties is at odds with the teaching of the first Christians. So I went out and I bought a copy of Heth and Wenham's book. I put it on the shelf and figured I'd come back to it later on. And I just wanted to be sure for myself, as someone trained to be a pastor, that I wouldn't be leading people to commit adultery. I mean, after all, the New Testament has these really strong statements against divorce and remarriage. So in Mark 10, 11 to 12, Jesus says, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. Also, she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. And so it seems like Jesus was labeling any divorce or marriage here an act of adultery. So as a pastor, I mean, I wouldn't want to be complicit in that. And so the stakes seemed awfully high in this discussion. So I put it on the shelf and kind of tabled it at the time. But about 10 years later, the issue came up again. I was teaching an upper level course in the Synoptic Gospels at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. And I discovered that historical Jesus specialists had concluded that we can be about as certain as is possible in the discipline that a critically reconstructed historical Jesus did not permit people to marry again after divorce. So here, that same question again was coming up in the classroom. Well, about that time, two close friends of mine who were both pastors were marrying recently divorced women. And in our conversations, I just couldn't find a way in the Bible to justify remarriage after divorce. Well, those conversations would eventually lead to this book, especially as I was entering at that point in the ministry and wanted to make sure for myself of things in case I found myself being asked to marry divorced people. But ultimately, if remarriage after divorce is adultery, then we as Christians would not want to be leading people into adultery, but by our teaching and our practice. And so I think the stakes are really high in this discussion, whether you agree with me or not.
Yeah, and just so for you and the listeners, I'm not here to agree or disagree. I thought this was an interesting book. And also, I'll note, this is the first book that I have received without requesting it. I got an email that just said, hey, thank you for your order. And I was like, what? But then it's, the cost is zeroed out. So it's like, oh man, I'm on a publisher's radar. I got to reach out to this guy and make sure I coordinate it. Sorry, I'm a slow reader. Okay.
You must be doing something right.
Yeah, I bothered enough scholars that the people who publish their books are now rewarding me for that. So, okay, zooming back out though to look at the context, because the context of the New Testament is, like I said, it's those multiple threads, and the first one, the foundational one that you start with, is the Greco-Roman world. Was there any controversy around divorce, remarriage, any of that in the ancient Greco-Roman world?
Yeah, and I personally, I'd extend it also to ancient Judaism. I mean, these are the worlds in which early Christianity was finding its origins. I was tackling in the book Remarriage After Divorce among the first Christians, but I mean, they lived in the intersection of these varying worlds, Greek, Roman, Jewish, and those worlds were influencing the very first Christians. But 1991, Craig Keener published a book called And Marries Another. And then in 2002, David Instone Brewer published Divorce and Remarriage in the Bible, two really big books on this topic. And both were claiming that in the ancient world, a divorce always entailed a corresponding freedom to marry again. I mean, nobody would have questioned it. And then that means that when the first Christians divorced for reasons that were permissible, the possibility of remarriage would just have been assumed. So many gospel commentators you'll see follow their lead. R.T. France, in his Matthew commentary, said that no one in the first century world would ever have questioned the propriety of remarriage after divorce. So people who say otherwise, like Bill Heth or Gordon Wenham from that 1984 book, they just don't fully appreciate the first century world. Well, about the same time Instone Brewer's book was coming out in 2002, Bill Heth wrote an essay on how he changed his mind and had come to agree that remarriage after a legitimate divorce is perfectly acceptable. And he attributed his change in mind in no small measure to the fact that, I mean, no one in the first century world ever questioned remarriage after divorce. That really hit him kind of hard in his discussions with, especially with Craig Keener and David Instone Brewer. And that's actually where I began in remarriage and early Christianity, because I think that these ancient cultural assumptions need to be placed up front. They need to be recognized. So what David Instone Brewer did, he collected every single divorce certificate he could find from the ancient world and placed them on a website for people to review and study. And these certificates regularly will say that the divorced wife is, quote, free. And that was the language the certificates would use. So the former wife is free to marry someone else. no future potential husband need worry that she's a taken woman or that he's violating another man's wife. So the Greeks and Romans would give out these divorce certificates, but I mean, so also with the Jews. I mean, the Jews around the year 200 created a document called the Mishnah. I mean, it recorded their interpretations of the Torah of Moses. And one of the tractates in the Mishnah is called Gittin. It's named after the Jewish bill of divorce, their divorce certificates. So Jewish men, upon divorce, would give their wives these certificates, and it was supposed to read, "You are a freed woman. You belong to yourself. The wife was now free." It's the same freedom we see in the Greek and the Roman divorce certificates. So Josephus, this first century Jewish historian, will talk about how husbands would divorce their wives, but had to give them the divorce certificate. And we've actually come across examples of these first century Jewish divorce certificates that have survived, and they spell out how the woman's now free or permitted to marry another man. Deuteronomy 24, verse 4 in the Torah says that when a man divorces his wife, he's supposed to give her a certificate. And in fact, these divorce certificates actually go back well before the first century, all the way back to the time of the Assyrians in 1400 BC, the later Babylonians. They would pronounce the wife, quote, free to marry again, or that she may go wherever she wishes. So Jewish practice on divorce or marriage was the same as the Greeks and the Romans, as well as the ancient Assyrians, the Babylonians. But, and this is a crucial point, that widespread acceptance of remarriage is precisely what makes Jesus' teaching in the gospel stand out. Jesus takes a very different view, as we'll see. He talks about remarriage as adulterous, and that's something unexpected in this world. Now, here's the key question in all this, is the idea that Jesus would label remarriage adulterous so outlandish in the ancient world as to be ruled out as just wrong. And here's where Instone, Brewer, and Keener came up short. There are indeed those of the Roman world, the Greek and the Jewish, where people, albeit a minority, would question the propriety of remarriage or might view it negatively. And so for the Romans, you come across these inscriptions dedicated to what are called univira, or women who remain faithful to a single spouse in the course of their whole lifetime. You have references in literary sources of the period of these women. There are even references to men promising to remain faithful to a single spouse for their lives, and inscriptions honoring the men, although not as many as for the women. And then in the Greek world, you occasionally have inscriptions where a partner is celebrated for or promises to have only a single spouse for a lifetime. Greek romance novels would narrate surviving spouses crying over the graves of their loved ones and promising never to marry again. In the Jewish world, or in the Qumran community, a fragment of what's called the Damascus document gives permission for a male community member to marry an unmarried virgin or a widow who's not had sexual relations after the death of her husband. The widow could remarry. And the document doesn't even consider the possibility that the divorce could marry again. It's not even an option. And that fragment places in perspective another passage of the Damascus document, one talking about not marrying two women in their lifetimes. And that means this would be a reference not to polygamy, but to a second wife after the divorce of the first, while that first wife still lived. And then you have a third document at the Dead Sea. It's called the Temple Scroll. It requires a future king not to take another wife while the first remains alive. Remarriage is only permitted after a spouse's death and not after divorce in these three Jewish texts from the Dead Sea. So what we have here is a minority position in the ancient world celebrating a lifelong marriage that renders Jesus' teaching in the Gospels more understandable, at least.
So when you mention the certificate, I want to take a step back and hang out there for a minute. For us, for the contemporary world, the listeners and myself, can you do us the favor of explaining what was the process or the range of processes in the ancient world that would be applicable to early Christians or to those like present when Jesus is teaching for divorce, so that we don't read back our experience or our understanding if that's not correct?
Yeah, I mean, this is where Instone Brewer's work's actually very helpful in my view. I mean, you have to keep in mind that this issuing of divorce certificates we've been talking about in the ancient world, it actually wasn't that frequent. I mean, in most cases, divorce was simply for one or both spouses just to decide to separate. So when Paul uses the verb leave or separate in 1 Corinthians 7:10-11, that was one of the normal words used for divorce. And so you have this instance where Cicero, that he's this first century BC Roman statesman, and he narrates how this Roman citizen left his pregnant wife behind in Spain when he went to Rome. So in Rome, he married another woman without the first wife's knowledge, and after she died, after he died, she gave birth to a son. So Cicero's wondering whether the son of the second woman was illegitimate because there had been no divorce document given to the first wife, and so maybe the second wife could be considered a concubine. Or then again, maybe the second wife was the real one, and the first wife or the first marriage had ended by separation. And it turns out that the legal scholars of the day just didn't know. Couples would divorce by separation all the time. One party would choose to leave the other, and conversely, merely living together would constitute a marriage for a man and a woman. So the divorce certificates, when you had them, helped clarify matters where there might be confusion about what had happened. And again, it especially helped the divorced wife when she met a prospective new suitor. That's where it came in helpful.
But so whereas in, I'll just say in contemporary America, in 21st century America, generally you go to the courthouse, you file the paperwork, and the state acts, in a family court as a mediator for that kind of certifying this is the agreement, this marriage is now ended. And so at least for property and custody and all of that kind of thing, this is what it is. Were there mediating bodies, just to kind of cover the nitty gritty, like the ground level stuff for what a divorce was in the ancient world? Were there mediating bodies in the ancient world?
No, this is strictly between the husband and the wife. So I mean, they could do this unilaterally on their own, nobody else involved, and that's a divorce or that's a marriage.
Yikes, that sounds scary.
You could do
That's
that.
a lot of vulnerability.
Yeah,
Okay.
nowadays we have to have the state get involved, so it's much more official now.
Well, but I mean, a certificate, it seems like, so it's certifying something. So like, I mean, there weren't witnesses or anything involved? I mean,
You
there's
could
some
have
aspect of the
witnesses.
community.
Yeah, you could have witnesses, but it's just mainly it gives that wife an uncontested freedom to marry someone else. In other words, a future husband doesn't have to worry that he's trespassing on another man's property because this is a patriarchal world. That's how they think in antiquity, that you're safe to marry this woman.
Okay. So okay. That's a really helpful, like in a nutshell kind of way. So because we're talking about early Christianity, we're probably going to need to camp out on Jesus for the longest time. So I want to start with this, and I hope maybe this is a good transition into the relevant gospel passages. But so if I take what you're saying correctly, what you're saying is it was not a complete novelty. It wasn't unprecedented to say remarriage after divorce is out of the bounds. But was Jesus still proclaiming something radical in the Gospels?
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember this is a minority tradition. I mean, the vast majority of the ancient world would freely accept divorce and remarriage. It's just these are very minority, very very rare traditions. Otherwise, they're there. They lend plausibility to all this, but they're not common. So, I mean, divorce and marriage are permitted, but that's precisely what brings into stark relief Jesus' teaching. So, when you again, I was looking at Mark 10:11-12 a little bit ago. It says, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. Also, she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." So we were talking about this passage earlier, but to return to it, this is totally unexpected. It's very against the grain of the surrounding world. And when you look at Mark's teaching here of Jesus, this is emphatic. It takes place privately with the disciples. It's inside a house. Those are ways that Mark emphasizes the teaching is important. It's private in a house. It's the disciples. But even more, Mark places this saying, this narrative, smack dab in the middle of a section of his gospel on discipleship. And discipleship's tough. It's demanding. But at the end of the day, as Jesus says, what's in that very chapter, what's impossible for human beings is possible for God. And so God enables this challenging life of discipleship, even adhering to Jesus' teaching about divorce or remarriage. And notice, as Jesus is talking here, there's nothing about the divorce certificates. There's nothing about innocent parties. It's just absolute teaching. So as Mark's community was listening to this gospel being read, they would have concluded after hearing it that divorce or marriage are adulterous. It's how Jesus was remembered as having taught, and they would have practiced accordingly.
So let's just run through. So Luke 16 is the next passage.
Yeah, it's another one.
So walk us through that, because I do want to. I want to get through all the Gospels, because I know that I have some questions, like deeper questions there. But
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, Luke 16:18. That's another passage like this. It says Jesus is teaching there. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery, and everyone who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. So it's absolute here against divorce or remarriage. It's emphatic teaching for Luke as well. I mean, Luke has Jesus saying in the verses right before this, the law and the prophets were until John. And since then, the good news of the kingdom of God has been proclaimed, and everyone is urgently invited to enter it. But it is easier for one stroke of a letter in the law to drop out. So, in other words, not one stroke of a letter in the law is to drop out. And then in the story just afterwards, just after Jesus' divorce and remarriage teaching, we have this rich man and Lazarus, which concludes with the rich man's being told if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they'll not be persuaded as someone rises from the dead. So divorce or marriage is at the heart of what it means to listen to the law and the prophets. Well, if that's the case, then, not surprisingly, adultery turns out to be at the top of the list of the commandments in Luke's gospel. So in Luke chapter 18, verse 11, we meet a Pharisee and a tax collector, and the Pharisee says, God, I thank you. I'm not like other people, greedy, unrighteous, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. So one of the marks of law observance is to live a life free from adultery. In Luke 18:19, Jesus gets approached by this rich young man. And what's the first commandment that Jesus mentions to him from the law of Moses? Do not commit adultery. And then do not murder, do not steal. Adultery is the preeminent command in this second table of the law. So although the context of Luke 16 is primarily about keeping the law of Moses and how you use your possessions, Luke has Jesus teaching on divorce or marriage here, and it sticks out in its context. In a context, it's really about the use of possessions, but that's precisely the point. It sticks out for emphasis. For Luke's audience, there is to be no divorcing or remarrying, since that's adultery, and it's unfitting for a disciple of Jesus Christ or for the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Luke 16:18, an absolute statement of Jesus.
So as we move into Matthew 5, it does get a little less absolute. And this is where a lot of the arguments that question the certainty, this is where they're predicated, right?
Right.
So,
yeah, I mean, yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, which one do you want me to tackle first?
You just keep going. Whatever's going through your brain, I want to hear.
Well, I mean, right, Jared. I mean, there are these two passages in Matthew, and thankfully Jesus makes an exception. So it's sort of a pressure release valve, if you will, here in Matthew. We get this teaching in Matthew chapter 5:32, and Jesus is recording exception to his strict teaching. I mean, for us as moderns, we're grateful for that. So in Matthew 5:32, we read, "But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of unchastity causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." So what can we conclude from Matthew's exception here? Well, first of all, divorce is adulterous. It's like all the other sins a man commits in this context. To divorce his wife is just as sinful as lusting, or murder, that whole list of what a man can do. But even worse, not only is it sinful for the man, the husband is causing his wife to commit adultery. And that's because in this patriarchal world, most divorced women would need to marry again to survive. I mean, a few could return to their father's house, assuming the father's still alive and that the father could afford it. But most of the time, that wasn't possible any longer. And marriage to someone else was the only option. Now, many scholars like to talk about how a divorce certificate would free a wife to marry someone else, or others will talk about how innocent parties can marry again, So keep those two key concepts in mind as you're reading Matthew 5:32. And did you notice what Jesus says here in Matthew 5:32? It's just totally unexpected. I mean, whether the former wife had a divorce certificate in her hand or not, even if she was innocent, she would be committing adultery to marry someone else. So, what happens is that one church body tried to get around this by saying that the woman is merely regarded as an adulteress or is seen by such as others, but isn't actually an adulteress. So, in other words, if you translate the word that way, you would have an innocent party here in Matthew 5:32, since she's merely stigmatized as being adulterous. She's not actually committing adultery. So it's an ingenious solution to this problem, but it has a problem in itself, and that's that the Greek verbs, even when they're being used in passive forms, that like we would want to stress here, even when the Greek verbs for committing adultery are used in their passive forms, they bear active senses in ancient Greek. The words always mean to commit adultery and never to be regarded as or stigmatized as adulterous, or even as the adulterer in the second part of the verse. It's just amazing to me how people have not actually looked at how the two Greek words for commit adultery in this verse get used in other ancient Greek literature. Now, Jesus makes an exception when the wife is guilty of sexual sin. And that's just to say, how could a husband in divorcing cause his former wife to commit adultery if she already has? I mean, he could divorce her and remain innocent in the process. Now, that the divorced woman would need to marry again is clear from the second part of the verse when Jesus turns to marrying a divorced woman. In other words, it's not something that we're reading into this verse from the culture, it's there within Jesus' reasoning. So then Jesus turns his question, may a man marry a divorced woman? And Jesus says no, or you'd be committing adultery. And notice that Jesus does not say whether the woman is herself innocent or guilty. Wouldn't have been nice if he had. It just doesn't matter. If a woman's divorced and you marry her, regardless of the circumstances, you're adulterating, period. So while Matthew 5:32 does make an exception, it's only to permit divorce in a very specific situation. Remarriage is categorically adulterous in this passage from Matthew as well.
So it seems like, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit more, but it seems like the juxtaposition between Jesus and other similarly radical perspectives on divorce or remarriage, I guess, is they're not as concerned with the practical issues, at least not explicitly. And they're concerned with like a proto definition of what marriage is. Is that fair to say?
Well, I mean, you get this. Jesus himself gives a proto definition of what remarriage is in his case. You have that in another passage in Matthew chapter 19, but it was also in Mark 10. Should we think, should we sneak over to Matthew 19 for a little bit?
Yep. Yep.
So, what's happening in Matthew 19, and this gets to that definition here of what marriage is about. What Jesus says here, he's confronted by the Pharisees here in Matthew 19. They're wondering if you can get divorced for any reason at all. And so Jesus is responding to that, and he says they would have probably appealed to, well, they were appealing to Deuteronomy chapter 21 with 24 with the divorce certificates, in Deuteronomy 24. They were appealing to that you give a wife a divorce certificate. But Jesus doesn't appeal to Moses. He appeals back to creation. And he says, haven't you read that in the beginning, God created male and female? And so you have this one man, this one woman coming together in marriage. So Jesus is appealing to creation, that God's will really is for there to be one man with the one woman in marriage. And that's how Jesus defines it. It's God's will. And it's God's will that's being set aside when a man divorces his wife, because the one man, the one woman have been brought together. And it's God's will that's being violated when there's remarriage. So it's creation that Jesus appeals to as normative for humanity here.
But that's not necessarily going outside of Moses. It's just going to a certain perspective of Moses. Is that, I mean, so I'll call this out. I read this book not long after I finished seconding Sinai, and so I was thinking about the idea that she talks about there of all of these new or innovative ways of thinking within Judaism in Second Temple Judaism are still appealing to Sinai in some way. They're still appealing to Moses in some way. So referring to the Genesis story, the story of creation, you're not really deviating from orthodoxy that much. And that does seem to help challenge what is kind of a utilitarian or pragmatic approach to divorce. Is
Yeah, I
that
mean, it'd be kind of like this. It's parallel to what Paul is doing, let's say, in Galatians 3. So in Galatians 3:15 to 18, he'll talk about how the law came 430 years after a promise. Well, both the promise to Abraham and the law that came later are still in the Torah. And so what Jesus is doing here is similar to that. He's even as Paul will appeal to the Abrahamic promise over the later Mosaic law, Jesus is doing something similar here. He's saying, let's get back behind the divorce certificates of Moses. And by the way, Moses was only allowing these things because of the hardness of your heart. Let's really go back to creation, because creation is where God gives his will for humanity. He's staying within the realm of the Torah, but it's just that creation trumps what Moses later said.
and so I'm glad you brought up Paul, because we are going to need to talk about Paul. You can't talk about New Testament stuff, unfortunately, or whatever, without talking about Paul. Some people don't like that, but so Paul doesn't really think, hey, none of you guys should really get married. You're better off if you don't get married, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, Paul actually prefers celibacy. And so, and
So
here's
this
why.
whole thing is almost like, I don't know why I
Yeah,
even have to talk about this at all, but here I go. Well, not me, but the Lord,
yeah,
right? That's
yeah. I mean, it's a Paul has his preference for believers to remain single. Definitely so. It's an interesting point here, and here's why. Even though Instone Brewer and others have said the divorce in the ancient world always entailed a corresponding freedom to marry again, Instone Brewer is going to fully admit, let's say, that the first Christians in those early centuries were not permitting remarriage after divorce. He just concedes this up front. So if the first Christians didn't think that the divorce certificate assumed the freedom to marry again, where did this outlandish countercultural view come from, if not the teaching of Jesus and the apostles? So if the early Christians hold that view, why can't the New Testament authors? Well, so what happens is that some then say that the first Christians were getting influenced by their larger world to take a radical stance against remarriage. They were what are called ascetics, who did not believe in sexual relations or marriage. And so they'd want people to abstain from marriage and stay single. And so the first Christians were influenced by this. So Craig Keener and David Instone Brewer both believe that the early Christian witness against remarriage should be dismissed, or probably dismissed, if not tempered, because they were just too influenced by the ascetic currents of their day. Bill Heth even attributed his change of mind on remarriage largely to the conclusion that the first Christians were radical ascetics. So were the first Christians ascetics? And this will play into how we understand the New Testament as well. And what often goes unmentioned is that asceticism is really tricky. It's really hard to define. I mean, it typically involves depriving yourself of bodily desires, usually food or sex. So were the first Christians ascetic? Is this, how is it ascetic in the typical sense when the first Christians, let's say, valued marriage between a man and a woman? They may not have allowed for remarriage, but they certainly permitted that first marriage. And so there's this important essay I'll highlight in the book by a guy named Callistus Ware, who's going to distinguish early Christian ascetic patterns of thought from others. So for the first Christians, they were always world affirming. They were never world denying. They're not like other ascetics. You withdraw from your bodily desires for a time, but not because the material creation was somehow bad, but just to serve the Lord more fully and to serve your fellow human beings. So you'd withdraw from the world for a time, only then to re-engage the world. Now, if we're going to disqualify, let's say, the first Christians for ascetic elements in their teachings, and here's a key point, we're going to have to throw out Jesus, and we're going to have to throw out Paul as well, because you get the same elements right there in the New Testament. Jesus will tell men that lusting after a woman is adultery in Matthew chapter 5, just before that divorce and remarriage teaching. Or in Luke 14:26 and Luke 18:29, he'll ask husbands to hate their wives and even to leave them for the sake of wholehearted ministry. In 1 Corinthians 7:1, the Corinthians thinks it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Well, I mean, Paul disagrees for the sake of a married couple, but even so, they should abstain from sex for a time for the sake of prayer, if it's possible. Widowers, they should remain single as Paul is, if at all possible. And Paul warns those considering marriage that they're going to have trouble in this life in 1 Corinthians 7:28. And then right after that says that, you really should be living as if the present form of this world is passing away. In verses 32 to 35 of 1 Corinthians 7, as we're kind of moving through this chapter, he says that an unmarried person can serve the Lord more fully and without distraction than can a married person who has a spouse. And then even the widow, at the end of 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 39, will do better to remain single than to remarry. So the first Christians, including even Jesus and Paul, were ascetics, just not extreme. So if we're going to dismiss the first Christians, we should keep in mind that they're striking the same balance in their teachings as Jesus and the apostles. And we'd end up having to dismiss the entire New Testament as well.
So when you say ascetics but not extreme, and I do think you framed it, but I want to make sure I understand. Ascetics but not extreme means they still appreciate the material world.
Yes, they're world affirming, and therefore marriage is not to be denigrated. So when you read in the pastoral epistles about how there are these teachers who are denigrating marriage, the first Christians took that passage very seriously. We do not denigrate marriage. We do not denigrate God's good creation. But we're ascetic in the sense that we believe that you may need to withdraw from the world for a time to re-engage it more fully for the sake of the Lord. And here they're taking their marching orders from passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where if you're able to remain celibate, this is actually the preferred state. Marriage is great, and we're going to affirm that. It's God's creation, but you can serve the Lord. The time is short, so you can serve the Lord more fully if you can do it as a single person.
As I was reading this, hold on. Sorry, my brain is really scattered, so please bear with me. I don't know if you've listened to the podcast at all, but I do this. I'll ramble and hopefully find a question in there somewhere. I think historical Jesus stuff is really interesting because, and to go back to a conversation I had last year with Curtis Freeman, I was not aware of this until I talked to him. It wasn't a thing that I noticed, but I grew up in this world where he's saying evangelicals, probably particularly American evangelicals, they view the significance of Jesus as the crucifixion. And really, even the resurrection is subordinated to that. And so it's like all the material stuff. So, but the more I've thought about it, and especially reading this book, kind of trying to frame the historical Jesus stuff to be able to ask good questions, I was like, I don't think, I didn't even know there was historical Jesus stuff except for, apologetics proving that this or that thing happened. So I don't remember sayings of Jesus being really significant except for something like around divorce. And then it was only as significant as like the certain Hebrew Bible passages that I would hear. Also in the same conversation I would hear, well, we don't live under the law, but they would refer to certain Hebrew Bible passages to prohibit or discourage certain behaviors. So is there a more substantive way of understanding the historical Jesus? And I think this is a really good angle of entry into that. Do you think there's a more substantive way of kind of mending together the world that Jesus lived in, understanding an historical Jesus, and then what kind of disentangling the theologizing of Paul that we've done that really seemed to disassociate him from an historical Jesus as we try to build an understanding of the early church? I hope that was a discernible question.
You really can't disentangle Paul from the historical Jesus question either, because Paul includes a lot of quotations from Jesus at different points in his letters. So we're dealing with one in 1 Corinthians 7, 10 to 11, when we find the Apostle Paul quoting Jesus' teaching about divorce and remarriage there as well. And that becomes some of the data, the raw data we're using for this historical Jesus analysis. So even Paul will refer to Jesus' teaching. But it's a scholarly venture that we shouldn't dismiss right away, because it's I put in the book, I said that Craig Evans made a really important point for Protestant evangelical scholars and for people interested in the Bible, that as you pointed out, well, it does serve an apologetic function. And so if you are dealing with someone who's hyper skeptical about Jesus' existence, certainly you can show that Jesus existed. We have material from Josephus or the second century Tacitus. There was a Jesus in history. But the problem is that what we know about Jesus needs to be filled out. And so if you're going to be hyper skeptical, applying a historical Jesus methodology can help fill out our picture of the first century Jesus. And so that's why scholars are interested in it. The whole second chapter in the book is talking about historical Jesus research and what it's about. Because the Gospels are not strictly historical documents, but they record history, but they're written from the perspective of faith. They're written by those who themselves believe in Jesus. And so what the historical Jesus specialist wants to do is to place these documents of faith on a witness stand, if you will, and interrogate them to glean this more assured information about Jesus. And so we're playing a critical game here. And so we're going to be using criteria in this venture. And so one of the criteria that historical Jesus specialists will use is multiple independent attestation. And actually, we're actually in good shape there when we apply that to Jesus' teaching on divorce or marriage, because it's in Matthew, it's in Mark, it's in Luke, it's also in the Apostle Paul. And all these passages in divorce or marriage can be traced ultimately to two independent streams of tradition when you apply the criterion. So, and if it turns out that Matthew happens to have both of them in his gospel, but with an exception clause. And then there's a criterion called dissimilarity. And this is where Jesus is saying or doing something that other Jews in his day weren't saying and doing, and what his first followers weren't saying or doing. And so the point here is that, whose interest would be served by making that tradition up? It must have been original, because Jesus is saying something that we don't like to say. Well, it turns out certainly the Jews of Jesus' day were freely divorcing and remarrying. And yet Jesus makes these absolute statements against divorce and remarriage. And so for the historical Jesus specialist, Matthew may not have been entirely comfortable with them. He has these exception clauses. So he'll have Jesus making an exception. You have Paul, who has an exception of his own. Now, what you have to keep in mind is that all these criteria in this venture have their weaknesses, their limitations. So for multiple attestation, isn't that just an accident of history where two independent sources simply conveyed the teaching? At least we know they weren't making it up themselves, but that doesn't mean that someone earlier didn't. The criterion just increases the likelihood that the teaching's coming from Jesus. As for dissimilarity, if we were going to be consistent with this criterion, well, we'd end up with a very strange Jesus. We'd have a Jesus who wasn't a Jew, a Jesus who didn't have any followers, clearly a weird, idiosyncratic figure. Didn't Jesus often say things that his fellow Jews and followers would agree with? So we don't use these criteria to reconstruct the Jesus behind the Gospels, but rather a Jesus behind the Gospels, a more assured, minimal Jesus, but not all that there was to him. So we need to have some humility about the limitations of this enterprise. But if you're doing historical Jesus research, John Meyer wrote this famous multi-volume work. It's called A Marginal Jew. It's on historical Jesus. And he agreed with others that we can be just about as certain that Jesus taught strictly against divorce or marriage as we can about just about anything in the discipline. Now, the biggest critique of historical Jesus research, I lay it out in the book. It's from a newer field called memory studies. And so for these scholars, all historical reporting involves memories. And so I took this newer approach and suggested that we look at how Jesus was remembered as teaching on divorce and remarriage. And so I began with Mark and Luke's Gospels and how Mark and Luke remembered and taught their communities that divorce or remarriage are simply adulterous. And that's how Jesus was remembered as having taught. And so that's how I kind of modulate this venture in the book and in my own research.
How much So I think it was probably Bandits, Prophets, and Messiahs that exposed me to the idea that there were
Horsley, right?
similar. Oh yeah, I love Richard Horsley. For the listeners, buy whatever you find by Richard Horsley. That exposed me to the idea that there were similar adjacent movements situated around Jesus. So you mentioned Qumran. Were there others that we see having a similar attitude to the one that we find in Jesus
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
teaching?
it's. I was just talking about dissimilarity. Where is Jesus totally unlike other people in his world? But one historical Jesus specialist, Tom Wright, has himself tweaked dissimilarity. Where is Jesus unlike the Jews of his day and the first Christians to say, well, I mean, there should be some continuity with the first Christians and other Jews. It can't be totally dissimilar because then it seems very strange. And so he'll modulate it to also include double similarity. And so I think you can take Tom Wright's where is Jesus similar to the other Jews and the first Christians of his day? Play with that a little bit as well. And that's why I stress that you do have some similarities to Jesus' teaching there in those documents, with the Damascus document and the Temple Scroll in the Dead Sea community. But for Jews, that's the only place I could find in ancient Judaism where there's any questioning of remarriage at all. So like I said, it's a very limited. It just adds plausibility that Jesus is not so outlandish after all in taking this approach. I talked about the traditions of the Roman one spouse traditions. That's primarily Roman. And so what I've had to do a little bit is also show that it's also somewhat in the Greek world, but just not as much because Greeks tend to take divorce and remarriage for granted as well. So these are very small minority traditions. But what they do is they show that there were people in the ancient world who held still to that ideal that it's kind of like what you do in your marriage vows, that you promise to remain faithful to this person for the course of your lifetime. It's an ideal that reality is quite different, but there was still that ideal in the ancient Roman world, even to the point that Emperor Augustus had to issue marital legislation to encourage remarriage and families, because there were still some people in his world that were that more older, that conservative ideal still had influence. It had influence well after Augustus. It had influence into the early Christians. So Tertullian, a second century early Christian author, a late second century, early third century, will himself appeal to these Roman traditions about how you're supposed to stay faithful to one spouse over the course of a lifetime. And so he writes a tractate to his wife. And so at first he's like, okay, I guess you can get married again. But then later on, he rethinks it and says, no, it really should be one spouse for the course of a whole lifetime. So no, when I die, you can't marry again. But that was the influence of that Roman tradition on this early Christian author. It's a minority, but it's there, and it's probably why Jesus' teaching, why it could be taught and by the first Christians, and because there were those connecting points to the ancient world around them, just not a lot of them.
So I know there's a Pauline permission for widows to remarry, but the circumstances are like better that you do that than burn up from your lust. Right. Also, I just want to say it sounds like Tertullian was working through some stuff there.
Yeah.
Um, but so there it's permitted so that you're not consumed by lust, essentially. But it seems like an interesting distinction can be made there, because he's not permitting it for material reasons, which that's the first place my brain goes, is like, oh, this woman may be vulnerable socially or economically, and remarrying may be her best bet to be secure. Is there a reason, do you think? I know none stated explicitly in the text, or none that I could see, but is there a reason for that?
Well, I mean, Paul's going to talk about inordinate desires. And so that the satisfaction of your desires shouldn't be taking place in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 with a prostitute or somewhere else, but needs to be taking place in the context of a marriage. And so he'll say in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 7, he will allow, let's say, he'll in a marriage, then that is the place where a man can touch a woman. He starts the chapter off. It's with the slogan, "It's good for a man not to touch a woman," and Paul says, "Well, I mean, you're going to have these desires, and so a husband and wife may choose then to abstain from sexual relations for a time for the sake of prayer, but then they shouldn't deprive each other. They should come together again because that's the rightful expression of sexual desire." But all Paul does in those first 7 verses is he gives you an outlet in marriage itself. He doesn't go further with it. And so then the other passage you were looking at, well, what about verses 8 to 9? He's talking about widows in there and the unmarried. And so what you have to keep in mind is that in the ancient world, there's no word at this point in Greek usage that means widower. And so anytime you get this word unmarried, we get agamos is a Greek word. So I guess you get gametes in biology from it, this sexual material that comes together in reproduction. So agamos, so that's unmarried. It's a word you have to look at carefully in its context to see what it means. Well, in the ancient world, there's no word for widower being used at this point in Greek. So you would use alongside widow for widower, you'd use that word unmarried and widows. So Paul's talking about widows and widowers here, and he's saying that it would be ideal for them to be as I am. So if Paul maybe some evidence here possibly that Paul himself might be a widower. It's not certain, but maybe. But in any case, then he's saying that they should remain as I am. But if not, he allows that it's better to marry than to burn here in 1 Corinthians 7, 8 to 9 for the widows and the widowers. But then each little segment of the chapter, he's talking about a different situation. So he has the married people in verses 1 through 7. He has the widowers and the widows in verses 8 to 9. And then he comes to the married in verses 10 to 11. And here he says, this is the Lord's command. This is really emphatic. It's not even what I'm saying. It's not my own personal opinion. It's teaching I've received the Lord. And so he says, to the married, I give this command. It's not I'm not the one giving it. It's the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does separate, let her remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And that the husband should not divorce his wife. And so we have this strong prohibition. Now Jesus, in Jesus' teaching against divorce or remarriage, but at the same time, you notice that Jesus here envisions that a divorce might nevertheless take place despite the command otherwise. But if she does separate, then here's all we have then is a command. So we have a command not to divorce, but we're imagining that it might happen. But if it does happen, the only option Jesus gives, there's no exception here, that she is to remain single or be reconciled to her husband, and the husband just shouldn't divorce his wife, period. So this is very strong. It casts its shadow over the entirety of the chapter. And so when you have sexual desires, you're going to have sexual desires, but marriage is a place where they're to be satisfied. So if you've been divorced, then I'm sure Paul would say all the more, then you remain single. But if this is not comfortable for you, well, maybe you should be reconciled to your former spouse. This is what God has provided for you to address that situation.
And I don't know how far you want to go with this, but there's kind of a wide berth here. But someone who's married to an unbeliever or a new convert. So I don't know if Paul gets into the new converts, but you do talk about the early church, after the first century, that they were accepting of them. So how do we view non-believers married, or a believer married to a non-believer, and then eventually people being accepted into the church who may be in a second marriage after a divorce?
Yeah, so this is getting into, Paul will talk about believers married to unbelievers. We can talk about new believers maybe distinctly from that, but as for believers married to unbelievers, that's the exact situation Paul turns to right after giving this strong teaching on divorce or remarriage in verses 10 and 11, which he's relaying from the Lord. So it's important for historical Jesus teaching there. But in verses 12 to 16, Paul imagines that a spouse is in a situation where the unbeliever is really forcing upon them a divorce. He's saying, no, no, you should remain married. I mean, the teaching of Jesus, stay married, stay married, stay married. Paul will reiterate that again in verses 12 to 14. Stay married, stay married, stay married. But then he says that, over and over again, he'll say, and I put it in bold in the book because it's just repeated teaching. Stay married, stay married, stay married, stay married. This is what Paul's dealing with here. But then he says in verse 15 of 1 Corinthians 7, if the unbeliever leaves or divorces, then let him leave. A brother or sister is not bound in such cases. God has called you to live in peace. So what happens then is that, what do we do here? This is what's called the Pauline permission. So does it allow then a woman who's been divorced by, or a man who's been divorced by a non-Christian spouse, let's say, who's no longer bound to marry again? That's a possibility that people envision here. But it's really important to keep in mind here that that Paul actually doesn't use the word not bound. He doesn't use that Greek word. He's actually he actually does use the word not bound later in the chapter. So he'll say in 1 Corinthians 7:39 that a wife is bound as long as her husband's living. But if her husband dies, she's free to be married to anyone she wants, only in the Lord. So there's remarriage there explicitly in verse 39, but it's when the spouse has died, when the husband has died, then the wife is free to marry anyone she wants, assuming that person's a believer. So there you have it. And notice that Paul does not actually talk about remarriage here in verse 15 like he does with the widow in verse 39. So remarriage is never actually even mentioned in the verse. And he doesn't even use the word bound here, which, had he used that, might have made a connection to his later teaching in verse 39 more plausible, that maybe we are talking about being freed from a marriage and able to marry someone else. He doesn't use the language of freedom. Remember, in the divorce certificate, it's always freedom language that's characteristic of a divorce certificate. That's why that Greco-Roman background and Jewish background is so important. Because you remember in verse 39, Paul says if the husband dies, the wife is, quote, free to be married to anyone she wants, only in the Lord. Right out of the divorce certificates, only not applied to divorce, applied to the death of the spouse, which is itself kind of surprising. Not free if the spouse divorces you, not only if the spouse has died. So all that language is missing in verse 15. You don't have the bound language. You don't have the freedom of the divorce certificates. So then you ask, what language do you have? Well, Paul uses the word not enslaved. And when you look at not enslaved elsewhere in his letters, he'll talk in Galatians and in Romans about not being a slave under the law. So that's a good clue to what's going on here. Well, is there some law? Is there some command at issue here that we're not enslaved to? Well, if you've put don't get divorced in bold, all in the prior verses, we do have just that. We have a command here not to get divorced. But then if the unbeliever leaves, the brother or sister is not enslaved in these cases. Enslaved to what? Enslaved to this command not to get divorced. And so God has called you to live in peace. In fact, Paul returns in verse 16 to his hope that original marriage can be maintained. The original marriage, not a new one, because you might have an impact on your spouse and on the children. So, you should try it. He'll return to the hope for the original marriage even there, not hope for a new marriage. And so even though this verse, 1 Corinthians 7:15, is called the Pauline permission, it's often just very misunderstood and rarely interpreted within the context of the chapter.
So it seems like there's a transition in the maybe the rhetoric. I couldn't really point to it as we got into the early church, second, third, fourth century stuff. I couldn't point to a specific example, but it was just kind of a gut feeling that I had that this is transitioning from that idealized version of marriage into a more institutionalized understanding of marriage as the church starts to coalesce or congeal. So you can just say, "Yeah, that's not really there." If it's not really there, but does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, this sort of teaching of Jesus and Paul, this is so countercultural in their day. I mean, as Keener and Ensign Brewer rightly point out, This is exceedingly countercultural teaching. And so what's happening, you see happening here, it's no less countercultural for the first Christians in those early centuries of the Christian movement. I mean, they're living in a world where people freely divorce and remarry. So it's just as countercultural for them as it is for Jesus or Paul or the apostolic era. And what's happening then is that you find that these early Christians are trying to navigate these biblical passages. And that's something I try to stress in the book, that we're only coming to this position because there are these biblical texts that are and this biblical teaching that's moving us here. And so you'll find the early Christians trying to balance biblical texts. So they'll have one. Let me give you an example of this. One example would be that in First Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, where the overseer or the pastor or the bishop is to be the husband of one wife. So it's supposed to be a one wife sort of guy. And so the first Christians are going to say, then, well, okay, pastors have to be once married, but not more than once married. So they can't have remarried after divorce. But then if they're to be once married, what are you to do, let's say, if the pastor is a widower and has chosen to marry again? So does that disqualify them from the ministry? And if it disqualifies, let's say, a pastor from the ministry because they've married again after the death of the spouse when they should be serving the Lord more fully, well, then First Timothy is giving the attributes of your church leaders there, but they're also exemplary characteristics for all Christians. So should all Christians be, in that case, then once married and not marrying again after their spouse has died? And so what happens then is they'll take those passages on being a once married spouse in First Timothy chapter 3:2, or the widow in First Timothy 5, or Titus chapter 1, and then they'll try to balance that with Paul's passages in First Corinthians 7:39, also in Romans 7:2-3, that the wife whose spouse has died, whose husband has died, is now free to marry again. And so what happens is they'll go back and forth depending on which passage they're emphasizing, whether they'll permit remarriage in the case of the death of a spouse, or whether that second marriage is actually illegitimate because of the teaching of the pastorals. So what you have is this biblically framed debate, because this is a biblical set of teachings that's leading them to be countercultural. And so that's really the issue going on here in early Christianity, is how to apply these biblical. I'm just amazed by how biblical their reasoning is in these early centuries. And so we try to discount this. This is really the culture of the day or some other factor. It's really biblical text constraining their reasoning that I think is often lost when we read those early Christian authors.
It seems that so in this, and I know I keep using the word radical, but in this radical proclamation that, hey, this is what marriage is supposed to be. Divorce is not okay if you split up and you marry other people because of the intended purpose of this thing having been instituted in the first place. You're violating that intention. Okay, is there an eschatological or apocalyptic, whatever word, idea associated with this that does kind of flow into Paul's idea of like, hey, it's better to not be married? And I ask that because I'm middle-aged and I've just been like marinating in the idea that, oh, well, what matters to the Bible is, focus on the family type things. And like, hold on, you're not getting that from Paul, because he's not prioritizing the family and like a patriarchal society maintaining stability. That's not the concern. And it doesn't seem to be the concern for Jesus either, that marriage is not a central issue because we're not worried about how society is ordered.
Yeah, it really depends on where you are in the Pauline corpus. So if you're looking at the pastorals, I mean, arguably the theme of First Timothy is that this household of God, and so that the leader of the church needs to take care of his household well. That household leadership is at the top of the list in the pastorals. But when you, let's say, switch over to First Corinthians, I mean, because Paul's letters I did this essay for the Oxford Handbook of Pauline Studies, introducing the undisputed Pauline letters. And what I really stressed there, we had all sorts of specialized essays on Paul. And what I said was, at the end of the day, you have to recognize that Paul's letters are the shape they take is dictated by the circumstances he's having to address. And so Paul is going to be a bit more eschatologically inclined, end times inclined here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, let's say, than let's say in 1 Timothy chapter 3, and so where the household's at the center of it. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he'll say in verses 29 to 31 that you should live by the as if not principle, because the present form of this world is passing away. We don't know when Christ is going to come back again, but it could be at any moment. And so knowing that the time is short, doesn't that dictate how you're going to live with the time you have? And so wouldn't you want to be serving the Lord more fully? Marriage is fine. It's God's created gift to us. You should get married if you have if there's sexual desire, but then again, if you're able to remain fully, wholeheartedly focused on the Lord in celibacy, this is the preferred state. This is hard for us to hear in our day because we're children of the Reformation, and so from the Reformation tradition onward, family's good, and so it's almost as if single Christians become second-class citizens because they're not married in that. And so you'll go to sometimes Protestant churches and you look around, everybody's married. And shouldn't you be married? And that's a preferred state. Paul's way of thinking is a little different. For Paul, it's to be single is to be honored and esteemed because now you can serve the Lord wholeheartedly. And that's the ideal.
But I mean, on that, I kind of want to. I thought of this earlier, but the conversation was going in a different direction. When you said you can't disentangle Paul from the historical Jesus, I thought immediately people do, though, because people disentangle Paul from Paul. Like talking about 1 Corinthians, for example, it's a very material book, even in how it represents the resurrection. And that's a thing that I was pretty old. Well, I'm not old, but like I was getting on in years as I realized, like, wait, hold on. This is not like floating on a cloud. You're disembodied. You're not associated with a material reality anymore. People like disentangle Jesus from the historical Jesus. They disentangle Paul from Paul and the historical Jesus. And I think being a little bit more grounded and saying like, hey, this is really simple on divorce. But if we could use this as a way of kind of directing people back to like, hey, there was a guy named Jesus. Like, let's have a conversation about that, because I can't tell you how little it mattered. Like the Beatitudes mattered in my upbringing. They were so rare in an American evangelical church for me. And that seems really bad, right? Like, what is the substance of Jesus in the Gospels? Because why do we see these teachings? Why do we see miracles? And it can't just be, well, the crucifixion is the only thing that matters. Does that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's reclaiming the resurrection is very important in our day and age because people often have misconceptions about it. And it's not just ordinary people on the streets, ordinary Christians, but it's also even the scholars. There's this, tackle this from two different directions. I mean, if you're on the street, you think that after you die, it'll be some disembodied existence floating on the cloud somewhere, that it's some sort of spiritual existence that's ethereal or up there. And so that's why in the Gospels, you'll have these teachings about how Jesus was eating, food with disciples. It's very embodied, his resurrection body there. Well, Paul's not that different in that regard, but you might think so when you're reading, let's say, a lot of modern scholarship on 1 Corinthians chapter 15, because there was in the ancient world a Stoic way of thinking where even spiritual beings have materiality or kind of like that there are different types, different densities to different bodies. And so the human body is going to be, let's say, denser than a spiritual body. And so when you read that we're in 1 Corinthians 15, that we're raised with a spiritual body, then it'll be a different body, let's say, than our fleshly, earthly one. So about, I just want to do a plug here. There's a new book coming out from Eerdmans, I think next year, by an author by the name of James Ware. And Jim Ware, and it's really an extended commentary on 1 Corinthians chapter 15. But one of the key things he's doing in this commentary is really stressing that a spiritual body is still a body of flesh and blood. And so even for the scholar, let alone the non-specialist in churches, that we are going to, that Paul's stressing that we are going to have a fleshly body in the resurrection. And so there will be this new creation. The creations aren't even going to be left behind in Romans chapter 8. The creation's groaning in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. And so it's going to be a new world even for them. But there's even a creation involved here, a renewal of creation and flesh and blood bodies in the resurrection. So Paul is very embodied in his thought, and he's not devaluing it. And so marriage is valued here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, but even more the single life.
Okay. I feel like I took us really far afield, but thank you for
trying to bring it back.
Thank you for humoring me. No, I mean, hey, that was me. Don't hold. Anyone who listens to this podcast by this point knows that I just follow every thought that comes across my brain. Are there arguments, and you bring them up? I mean, you mentioned Keener and others, and I don't think that you are straw manning what they're saying, but are there arguments that seek to excuse divorce and remarriage that you think are compelling or in any way convincing?
Yeah, and I think Craig Keener and David Insman Brewer's books are great scholars. One's a friend. I mean, I think that they're really valuable contributions. So I'm taking their books very seriously and trying to work through this. Because I think they've set down they've established where that threshold here is, where the bar is for all this. I've certainly found biblical grounds, as we've talked about here, for divorce. Matthew's gospel talks about divorce as an option when the spouse is guilty of adultery. Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, as we've seen, talks about when a non-Christian chooses to divorce the Christian, although, I mean, a Christian divorcing the non-Christian is not permitted, but it can happen. So the New Testament does give us some limited cases where divorce is possible and where that won't involve a believer sinning. I'm not really parsing all that out in the book. I mean, my book's topic is remarriage. It's just, I just can't find anywhere in the New Testament where remarriage after divorce is permitted. I mean, when Paul says in Romans 7, 2-3, I mean, he's talking to the Romans and he says stuff that's, I mean, think about that. You're talking to Romans who themselves freely divorce and marry again. And so Paul's saying in Romans 7, 2-3, that a married woman is legally bound to her husband while she lives. But if her husband dies, she's released from the law regarding the husband. So then if she's married to another man while her husband's living, she'll be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she's free from that law, free. Then she's married to another man, she's not an adulteress. I mean, there are ancient parallels to Paul's language here in Romans 7, 2-3. And I put one in the book where it's not just death of a spouse, but divorce. The wife is free. Use almost the same language here in Romans 7, 2-3, but have divorce in there. And Paul counterculturally, takes it out. He has that teaching in Romans 7 to his non-Jewish audience there. He has that teaching in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So it's just, if I knew anywhere, I mean, where remarriage after death of the spouse is fine, but if I knew of any New Testament passage where remarriage after divorce is permitted, then I mean, I would have put that up front. That's where I wanted to end up. I would have mentioned in the book. I would have worked with them. I just don't know of any. So, but here's the thing. Maybe as people work with and use this book, Remarriage and Christianity, maybe someone will identify a blind spot I had somewhere along the way. I mean, it happens. We're all human, and I'm just a single scholar working on this. It's just that right now, having read what I've read, I just can't find anything out there justifying remarriage for a Christian after divorce.
I know we went back and forth over the last few days by email, so you had the questions, but was there anything when you got the questions that you were like, man, I really wish this was in here? Was there anything in the book that you really wanted to talk about that I didn't ask about?
No, I thought your questions were pretty thorough. I mean, we could talk about Matthew 19:9. I don't think we talked about that.
I think it did come up, but if you want to take a moment, go right ahead.
Yeah, we didn't really talk about Matthew 19:9. We could talk about that a little bit more because we talked about it in relation to Matthew 5:32. But this is one place, and we've talked about 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We've talked about Matthew 5:32, the exception there. But we didn't really talk about Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, except the part about Jesus teaching from creation. But um, Matthew chapter 19, 9, and I have to say right up front that if you're reading that verse, that the ancient manuscripts are split on it. The best manuscripts, I mean, some have wording that's actually identical to Matthew chapter 5:32. And you remember when we're looking at Matthew 5:32, Jesus wasn't permitting remarriage there, but granting that a husband divorcing an adulterous wife wasn't sinning to divorce a wife who's already adulterated. So if that reading is original and it's in some of our best, earliest manuscripts, then we don't have any possible gospel passage permitting remarriage. I just think that that's worth keeping in mind wherever we end up. But if we go with the reading that translators deem the most likely, we would have wording in Matthew 19:9 that differs from Matthew 5:32. We would have a possible permission to marry again. And so I think it's important to look at that verse from the point of view of those manuscripts. And when you do, the grammar of Matthew 19:9 is not entirely clear. Jesus is placing an exception clause here between two verbs. So you see there's a verb for divorcing and there's a second verb for marrying again. And so the verse reads, I tell you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. So then the question becomes whether the exception clause here modifying only the first verb, where you're permitted to divorce, or whether it also modifies the second verb, permitting also remarriage. And there are a number of reasons why I think that the exception clause really only goes with the first verb that'll to divorce. And so let me explain why. It's worth a couple minutes on this because it's such an important point. This is what's called a Matthean doublet. It's repeated teaching. So we were looking at how Jesus taught about divorce and remarriage back in Matthew 5:32. This is a doublet. He's talking about divorce and remarriage again here in Matthew 19. Well, in Matthew's doublets, the second instance always restates the first or shortens it. That's the pattern. So we have this prohibition of divorce in Matthew 5:32, but we also got an exception there that permitted divorce in a particular instance. But then we learned that remarriage of the divorced woman is strictly prohibited. There's no remarriage. So if we understand Matthew 19:9 the same way as Matthew 5:32, then Jesus would be permitting the divorce, but not the remarriage. That's how we'd want to take Matthew chapter 19. Also, you'll notice that this exception is placed right between the two verbs and not after them. So that's important. If it's between the two verbs and not after, that would indicate that more clearly that it's modifying only the first verb for divorcing and not remarrying. You put it after both and it's clearly modifying both. And here's a third reason. What's the understood verb in our exception clause? When you're reading, isn't the understood verb going to be what you've just read, which is to divorce? Jesus won't even get to remarriage until after he stated the exception clause. And again, keep in mind, the whole point of this conversation with the Jewish leadership was to address the situation of divorce. They'd asked Jesus, the Pharisees, about whether divorce is ever permitted. It's divorce that Jesus is permitting here in this one instance, and that was answering their question. And here's something else too. If Jesus is denying remarriage after divorce, as appears to be the case, then that would explain the disciples' shocked reaction, that they're reacting to some very strong teaching here. I mean, it's utterly unprecedented where they're saying it's just better not to marry. So the indicators, and not just the early Christians, how they were interpreting this, but the indicators in our passage itself are all pointing to this exception really only being for the divorce, with no exception being made for remarrying. And then if that's the case, it agrees neatly with Matthew chapter 5, it agrees with Luke 16, it agrees with Mark 10, and it agrees with 1 Corinthians 7. There would be this agreement in early Christian teaching regarding remarriage. We wouldn't have any permission for it. And so that's why really I'm arguing in the book is that this is where we find coherence and consistency across the early Christian witness.
I'm reminded as I'm listening to you of the grammar. There's a lot of grammar. If you read this book, it's a pretty helpful grammar lesson. So just slow down and take a deep breath. And then there's a lot of statistics too. Like you bring up, there's this many instances of this, like a verb being used in this way.
Yeah, I mean, my point there is that you can interpret the exception clause as modifying both verbs. You can do that. It makes good sense. Some people think it makes better sense. But you'd have this minority of Matthean commentators who see it going in, and they're leading ones. So you have people like Donald Hagner in his multi-volume commentary, or Ulrich Lutz in his multi-volume commentary, or Warren Carter in his commentary. I mean, it's a long list of famous Matthew commentators, Robert Gundry, and they all think that the exception clause really is only modifying the first verb, although the majority of Matthew commentators thinks it's both. And so that's why if you have these two options, then the question I'm asking is, what's a reasoned position? You can say whatever. I mean, you can say it modifies both. You can claim that. It's possible. What I'm trying to show is that the most plausible reading of the passage has it modifying only the first verb for all these various reasons and statistics.
And also, like you said at the beginning, that the reception of these texts has this one in kind of it's on shaky territory. Is that true of the other Matthean, Markan, Lucan texts as well?
Yeah, I mean that's the point. I think that I think that you have some discussions of these texts, let's say in the Shepherd of Hermas, where it's talking about repentance, with 1 Corinthians 7, with the Matthean text and beyond, whether the first Christians knew the Matthew text as we've reconstructed it. We can't say with certainty. They may have been following that alternate text that had Matthew 5:32 read in chapter 19, verse 9. My point is that you can actually work this argument both ways. On one hand, having a different reading in Matthew 19:9 is in some ways the more difficult reading because it differs from what you have in Matthew 5:32 and Jesus' teaching elsewhere. But it's also the harder reading, if you will, because the first Christians aren't adopting this point of view. And so it can also be the harder reading as well, to go with the Matthew 5:32 reading in 19:9. One shouldn't dismiss it too quickly. And so when the book I do is, I really find myself arguing out both sides of my mouth for both manuscript traditions. But it's very easy to see where you could argue it's the easier text to have the 19:9 reading as we have it in most of our Bibles today, because that might be a permission to remarry. And at a later point in time, there would be these pressures, after the Nicaea. And so maybe there were pressures to modify 5:32 and 19:9 to allow for it. You could go either way. My point is that if you take 19:9 as we have it in our translations, the best reading takes it as modifying the first verb. And if that's the case, if the early Christians had that reading available to them, then they were certainly interpreting it the same way.
What I like is that this confirms that in response to the question, what is the Bible? I get to say, good question, because like you said, we're not even sure if the text that we're looking at, or we're looking at a version of, is the same one that the people were reading for guidance and understanding in the early church that they were necessarily reading.
Well, here's the thing. It's not, I like to put it this way. It's not our right to unilaterally say what the original text is. All we can do is take that original witness. Most passages don't have a variant like this. When you're reading your Bibles, most passages just don't have this kind of textual variant. But we do have one here. And this is how the text has attested itself in those early centuries. And so we are within our right to take these variants as possible original readings of the text. We can reconstruct the original text, but maybe God's original is in one of the variants. We can't rule it out right away. And so we have to take seriously the variants too.
What should people read to get a better understanding of the many different topics and subjects and disciplines that you cover in this book. And you can be as broad or as specific as you'd like.
Well, I think you're getting an introduction to early Christianity. You're getting the first 4 centuries. So when you're reading, let's say, that chapter, you'll see who the key players are here, who the key authors are. I'm having to weave in all these various scholarly disciplines. So you have a chapter on historical Jesus. You get a sense of who the key players are, what the discipline's all about. And as you're reading my footnotes, you're getting kind of rabbit trails that you can follow if you want to learn more about historical Jesus research or the critiques of it, or memory theory, the new discipline. So along the way, I'm trying to give you key places you can go for more resources, not just on this topic, but also in general.
Yeah, no, for sure. This book is a good place to start. And you'll definitely find using this book as a jumping off point, as well as like following the bibliography and the footnotes to a further reading list. That's helpful. What do you read for fun?
I don't. If I read for fun, it's usually ancient Roman and Greek history, because that's fun.
If it's fun for you, it's fun for you.
Yeah, give me a biography of Themistocles and I'm happy.
Good. Well, okay. Well, so is that what you do to decompress, or like do you have other hobbies?
I find that fun. I've been reading a Scipio Africanus book recently, Liddell Hart's famous book. So I mean, to me, that's fun. Ancient history, but yeah.
I don't. You know what? You're not the first one to have this kind of like, oh, I'm not fun. No. As the wise sage Dave Grohl said, there's no such thing as guilty pleasures. If you like it, you like it. And he said that in a different context than what we're talking about here. But I don't ask that question to shame people. So if that's what you like, that's what you like.
If I get free time, I'm going to be reading Greek and Roman history.
Good. Then good on you. And whatever blows your hair back, right? So unless you have anything else for us, I feel like we can call this one good.
Well, thanks for having me, and I hope that people will pick up a copy of the book and work through it. It's certainly a very personal topic for a lot of people, so a little cognitive dissonance along the way is perfectly understandable. I mean, the question we're dealing with, maybe we can bracket it a little bit. What were the first Christians saying before we talk about how we appropriate it for today? And so we're all going to be grappling with that in our own ways. But if this is something that you'd have to be brought to kicking and screaming, I perfectly understand. It's not a comfortable position for me to hold, especially in my church tradition. And so I imagine it's not going to be a comfortable topic for a lot of people, and that's okay. Just try to bracket that for a moment and just see what the first Christians are saying here in the New Testament and early Christianity, and enjoy the ride.
And I think even if you're just interested in the history or the linguistic analysis, this is a wonderful example of that, and it's going to give you a lot of different branches to follow, a lot of different threads for you to continue to pull on. I mean, that's as complimentary as I can get about something, is that if you keep me thinking, so I don't think you have to necessarily be pigeonholed into, are you a part of a Christian church? Are you trying to navigate this for moral reasons? Are you just curious? If you're curious, this is a wonderful book. But
it's also a very personal topic. So
nope, I'm not.
Personal. Nope. People's situations are right there.
Absolutely. So that said, thank you so much for being here. This has been a real pleasure.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye.